A little girl was found shivering, her face pressed against a cold wall, clutching nothing but a worn-out teddy bear. When a millionaire CEO stopped to ask why, he uncovered a heartbreaking truth that no child should ever live through. What he did next changed both of their lives forever. Snow blanketed Boston that night, drifting down in soft but merciless sheets, covering the streets like a white shroud, turning the city into a cold painting where every corner whispered of silence and loneliness. And Daniel Mercer walked alone beneath the flickering streetlights, his breath rising in clouds that disappeared into the frozen air, his polished shoes crunching through thin layers of ice as his thoughts remained tethered to the lifeless boardroom he had just left, a place filled with applause for his brilliance, handshakes for his success, and hollow words that never reached the empty space in his chest. And though the world called him a millionaire CEO, he felt like nothing more than a man lost in the shadows of glass towers, a man who could buy anything but the warmth of a voice waiting for him at home. And as he turned down a quieter street where the wind howled sharper between the narrow alleys, he pulled his coat tighter around his shoulders, thinking only of sleep, until his eyes caught movement in the corner of darkness, a shape so small it almost blended with the wall, and instinctively he slowed, his steps echoing in the stillness, his breath caught as the flickering glow of a broken lamp revealed her, pressed against the brick wall, knees drawn to her chest, arms wrapped around something tattered and limp, a little girl no older than 6, barefoot on the ice, her thin dress fluttering weakly in the wind, her frame shivering uncontrollably, and in her small hands she clutched a teddy bear so worn that its fur was nearly gone, a toy that looked as fragile as she did. And Daniel's world stopped, the city fading around him until there was only the sound of his own heartbeat pounding in his ears, and he whispered without thinking, "God, what is she doing out here?" His voice trembling as if he feared breaking the fragile silence that wrapped around her. And for a moment he thought she might not even be alive, so still was her body, until he saw the faint mist of her breath rising like smoke from trembling lips that were already turning blue. And before he could stop himself, before reason could remind him that strangers did not kneel in frozen alleys, he stepped forward, lowered himself down, his expensive wool trousers soaking into the slush, his leather gloves brushing against the snow as he leaned closer, and in the gentlest voice he could summon he whispered, "Sweetheart, are you all right?" But the girl did not respond at first, her eyes hidden beneath strands of tangled hair that clung to her damp cheeks, and Daniel felt the sharp sting of fear that she was too far gone, fear that he had come too late. And then, slowly, painfully, she lifted her head, and the world tilted for him, because her face was streaked with frozen tears that sparkled like glass in the dim light, her wide eyes glistening with a silence that screamed louder than any words could, eyes that carried exhaustion far too heavy for a child, eyes that asked questions no child should ever ask. And Daniel's throat tightened, a lump rising as he tried to steady himself against the wave of emotions that threatened to drown him, because in those eyes he saw not just a girl abandoned to the cold, but the ghost of a memory he had buried deep, his sister Amelia, the one he could not save, the one lost to a system that swallowed children whole. And in that single fragile moment, beneath the falling snow, Daniel Mercer, a man who had built an empire on control and power, felt his entire life unravel, felt every wall he had ever built crack wide open, because he knew without question that nothing would ever be the same again. Daniel's pulse raced as the little girl's fragile whisper broke through the night, her words slicing deeper than the icy wind. And though he held her tightly in his coat, the coldness in her eyes told him this frost had lived inside her far longer than the snow outside. Her name, she said, was Lila Hayes, 6 years old. Lips cracked and trembling, hands reddened with the cruel bite of winter. And the way she clutched that torn teddy bear as though it were her only shield against the world made his throat close, because in her he saw not just a child abandoned to the streets, but a reflection of the sister he once loved and lost to a system that promised care yet delivered silence. "Where are your parents?" he asked, voice steady but breaking underneath, and when she answered with the fragile truth that an aunt named Veronica had locked her out until she could earn her dinner, Daniel felt an ache unlike any boardroom defeat, unlike any sleepless night in his penthouse, because money could never explain away a cruelty so intimate, so deliberate. His hand brushed gently against her hair, smoothing ice from her curls, and he whispered softly, No child deserves this. But her sudden flinch, her small hands gripping tighter onto the bear, carried a message unspoken. Fear, ingrained deep, fear of punishment for even speaking, fear of reprisal for being noticed, fear of being unwanted, and it reminded him of Amelia, his little sister, the way she used to hide bruises beneath long sleeves, the way she begged him not to tell anyone because she believed silence would keep her safe, and the memory tore open like a wound never healed, bleeding guilt into the night. Daniel bit his lip, forcing back his tears, whispering to himself that he wouldn't make the same mistake again. He wouldn't walk away. He wouldn't leave this child to freeze or to suffer behind closed doors that smelled of bitterness and rage. Yet Lila, with eyes too old for her years, shook her head gently, begging him not to make her aunt angry, whispering that Aunt Veronica hated when she talked to strangers, hated when she cried, hated when she asked for food, and Daniel's heart split at the thought of a woman using hunger as a chain around a child's neck. His grip tightened around the coat shielding her small body, and his jaw clenched with the fury of a man who built empires yet failed to protect innocence when it mattered most. And now here, tonight, fate had dragged him into the shadows to face his past through the trembling body of a girl who deserved warmth, not punishment. "Lila," he murmured softly, his voice low but carrying the weight of promise, "you don't have to be afraid anymore." Yet even as he said it, she shook her head with desperate urgency, pleading that he not take her back, pleading that he not tell her aunt, pleading that he forget he ever saw her because punishment would be worse. And those words made his chest burn because what kind of home teaches a child to fear safety, to fear kindness, to fear rescue? He wanted to storm through every locked door, to confront Veronica with the truth that children are not bargaining chips, not burdens, not shadows to be silenced. But he also knew from Amelia's story that timing mattered, that charging into a nest of cruelty without proof would only leave the child broken further. He looked into Lila's hollow eyes and vowed silently that this would not be just another passing moment of pity, that he would not let wealth excuse him from humanity, that he would not let lawyers and excuses drown her voice. The snow swirled around them, but Daniel felt a fire rising inside him, the fire of grief turned into resolve, of guilt transformed into duty. And he leaned closer, promising quietly that he would help her, even if it meant tearing down every wall her aunt had built, even if it meant confronting demons he buried long ago. And as Lila shivered against him, whispering that she only wanted to be good, that she only wanted to stop making people mad, that she only wanted to be loved, Daniel's soul shattered, for no 6-year-old should ever define themselves by how little trouble they cause. No 6-year-old should confuse love with survival. And as he held her tighter beneath his coat, he realized this was no coincidence, no accident of chance. This was his second chance, and he would not waste it. Yet in the corner of his vision, the lights of a nearby building flickered, shadows moving behind curtains, and he knew the world around them was watching, judging, deciding, and somewhere inside, he wondered, when morning came, would he have the courage to walk into Veronica's home and demand answers, or would he be forced to play the long game, gathering evidence, protecting Lila quietly, waiting for the moment when truth could finally break the chains holding her hostage? His heart thundered, his mind raced, but his arms held steady, because in that frozen night, beneath the weight of old grief and new vows, Daniel Mercer knew one thing with certainty. He had found a child worth fighting for, and he would fight, no matter the cost, no matter the storm, no matter the past that haunted him. The hallway outside Veronica Hale's apartment was dimly lit, the yellow bulb above Daniel's head flickering like it might give out at any second, and the deeper he inhaled, the more the stench of stale smoke and cheap liquor clung to his lungs, making the place feel less like a home and more like a trap. And when the battered door finally creaked open, he was greeted not by warmth or explanation, but by the sharp, cold glare of a woman whose hardened features told a lifetime of bitterness, her lips curling as though the very sight of him was an intrusion, and when she barked, "What do you want?" the venom in her voice made Daniel instinctively step closer to shield Lila, whose trembling hand clung to the hem of his coat, and though his instincts told him to stay calm, his voice carried an unshakable firmness as he answered, "I found your niece freezing in an alley. She's just a child. She needs care, not punishment." But Veronica's eyes rolled with practiced cruelty, and a smirk spread across her face as if she had heard his complaint 100 times and never cared once, and with mocking sweetness she retorted, "Don't listen to her little stories, she's dramatic, always playing the victim. What that girl needs is discipline, not strangers meddling in family business." And her words, soaked in dismissal, pierced Daniel with the sharp sting of déjà vu, because he had once stood powerless in front of adults who spoke the same way about Amelia, his little sister, painting her cries for help as mischief, until the system swallowed her whole, and he clenched his jaw so tightly his teeth ached, fighting the urge to unleash his fury then and there. Yet before he could shape his next sentence, Veronica's expression hardened, her hand gripped the door, and with a loud final slam that reverberated through the hallway like a gunshot, she shut him out, leaving Daniel staring at the chipped paint of the door, his breath hot with anger against the cold air of the hallway. And for a moment he stood motionless, fighting the wave of helplessness pressing in, until he felt a small tug on his sleeve, and when he looked down, Lila's tiny hand slipped something into his palm, a folded scrap of paper smeared faintly with crayon, and when he opened it under the dim light, the image nearly broke him, a crude but unmistakable drawing of a little stick figure inside a rectangle with a jagged line across the top, a closet door, and from the stick figure's eyes ran uneven blue streaks. Tears scratched onto the page by a child's desperate hand, and Daniel's chest burned as though someone had struck him, because this was no childish doodle. It was a confession, a silent scream carved in color, proof of nights locked away in darkness, proof that the cruelty wasn't imagination, but a cycle of torment repeating itself in another innocent life, and his hands shook so violently he nearly dropped the page, his mind flashy. Neng to Amelia's face, pale behind the bars of her foster placement window as she begged him not to leave, and though years had passed, the guilt came back like a flood, suffocating, unforgiving, reminding him of the promise he had broken. But tonight, standing in this hallway with Lila's drawing pressed against his palm, he swore to himself that history would not repeat, not if he had to put his entire empire on the line, not if it cost him every dollar he had. And as he glanced down at the little girl beside him, her wide eyes shimmering with a mix of fear and fragile hope, he knew without a doubt that what lay ahead would be war against cruelty, neglect, and the ghosts of his past. And with his jaw set, his breath steadying, Daniel tucked the drawing carefully into the inside pocket of his coat, placed a reassuring hand over Lila's tiny fingers, and whispered low enough that only she could hear, "I believe you, and I won't walk away." And though the hallway remained silent and the door remained closed, the weight of the promise hung heavy in the air, a vow that whatever truth this drawing revealed, he was ready to confront it head-on, no matter the cost. And with that certainty pulsing through his veins, he turned toward the frozen night once again, his mind already racing with what he must do next. That night, Daniel entered his glass-walled penthouse high above Boston, but instead of marveling at the glittering skyline that usually made him feel powerful, he felt an unsettling void pressing in on him, for every corner of the vast, immaculate space echoed with silence, a silence so sharp it seemed to accuse him. And when he set his keys down on the marble counter, his gaze fell back to the crayon drawing clenched in his hand, its childlike strokes crude yet devastating. A small figure locked behind a heavy door, and suddenly the pristine luxury of his home felt obscene, hollow, meaningless, because while he stood in warmth and privilege, a 6-year-old girl shivered in terror a few blocks away, and the thought made his chest ache as if a fist had closed in around his heart, and he whispered into the empty air, "Amelia, I couldn't save you, but I will save her." And the sound of his own voice cracked with grief as the memory of his sister swept over him like an icy tide, her face, young and hopeful, flashing in his mind, her laugh like a bell that had once filled his childhood home. And then the darker memory followed, the day she disappeared into the foster system, the last time he saw her through the car window as strangers drove her away, her hand pressed to the glass, her lips shaping words that still haunted him, "Don't let them forget me." And he had failed her, failed in the only moment she had needed him most, and that failure had carved itself into his soul, a wound that never closed. So now, staring at Lila's drawing, he felt Amelia's voice rising again, not as a ghost to torment him, but as a demand for redemption, and he tightened his fist around the paper, vowing through clenched teeth, "I won't walk away, not this time." And he began pacing the penthouse floor, his mind racing with questions: how to confront the aunt again, how to prove what was happening, how to protect Lila when the system had swallowed Amelia whole, and with each step his resolve hardened, until he stopped before the grand window that overlooked the city, the lights twinkling far below like countless lives, countless stories, and he realized money and power meant nothing if he couldn't use them to save one frightened child. And though the memory of Amelia clawed at him, something new stirred inside, a fierce determination that this was his chance to rewrite the ending, to fight for someone the way he hadn't fought for his sister. And as snowflakes began drifting past the glass, Daniel felt the weight of destiny settling on his shoulders, for he knew he was standing at a crossroads, one path leading to comfort and cowardice, the other to pay in risk and sacrifice, but also to salvation, and he swore to himself he would choose the harder path, because this time, he would not let innocence slip into darkness unguarded. The next morning, when the city was still blanketed in silence and the streets glistened with ice under the pale winter sun, Daniel stepped out of his car holding a paper bag that carried more than food. It carried a promise, for inside were steaming cups of hot chocolate, fresh pastries, a set of warm clothes, and a pair of tiny boots that looked far too small in his large hands, yet represented something immense. And when he knocked softly at the creaking apartment door, he found Lila standing just inside, her small figure half hidden, the teddy bear pressed tight against her chest like a shield, her wide eyes brimming with both hope and dread, and she whispered, "What if Aunt finds out?" The words so fragile that they almost broke in the cold air, and Daniel, lowering himself until his knees touched the worn-out floorboards, steadied his voice into something both tender and immovable as he said, "Then she'll answer to me. You are not alone anymore." And the words seemed to hang in the space between them like a lifeline, and though she trembled, something in her gaze softened, a flicker of trust where only fear had lived, and after a long pause, she tugged gently at his sleeve, leading him down the narrow hall, her small steps cautious as though each one was an act of defiance against the house itself, until she stopped before a door at the end, her tiny hand hesitating on the knob, her shoulders hunched as though expecting a blow, and when she finally pushed it open, Daniel's breath caught in his throat, for what lay beyond was not a bedroom, but a prison. A cramped closet with no light, no window, nothing but a stained mat on the floor, and a threadbare blanket curled in a corner, and above it, nailed into the wood, a heavy chain dangled like a cruel reminder of captivity, and Daniel felt his throat tighten so fiercely it hurt, his fists shaking with rage he struggled to contain, and, under his breath he muttered, "My God," his voice hollow with disbelief and grief, and he turned toward Lila, who stood at the doorway as though waiting for him to see the truth she had been forced to endure, her small face twisted in shame as though she were the one at fault, and Daniel's eyes burned as he crouched down, forcing his voice through the storm in his chest. "Lila, would you trust me to take you somewhere safe?" And in that moment, time seemed to freeze, the city outside forgotten, the world narrowed to a man's trembling question and a child's fragile choice, and Lila, clutching her teddy bear so tightly her knuckles turned white, let a tear slip down her cheek, her lip quivering as she whispered, "Please, don't leave me in the dark." And the words pierced Daniel deeper than any blade could, for he knew this wasn't simply a request to leave the closet, but a plea for a life she had never been allowed to live, and as she looked up at him with those pleading eyes, something unshakable settled in him, a vow that this little girl's nights of terror would end with him, and that he would be the shield she had never been given. The hospital smelled faintly of antiseptic and hope, a place where lives were mended but truths too often cut deeper than the wounds they sought to heal, and Daniel sat rigidly in the corner of the pediatric exam room as Dr. Maya Collins moved with quiet precision, her gentle hands brushing across Lila's frail arms, her practiced eyes cataloging every mark, every scar, every injustice carved into the child's small body, and her voice, though steady, carried the weight of sorrow as she murmured, "Bruises, old fractures, frostbite. This is long-term neglect," and each word landed on Daniel's chest like a hammer blow, his fingers gripping the arm of the chair until his knuckles whitened, his jaw clenched so tight he thought his teeth might react, and through the roar of blood in his ears he whispered, more to himself than anyone, "How could anyone let this happen to a child?" And his voice cracked with fury that burned hotter than the winter's chill. But before Maya could answer, the door burst open with a violent shove, and Veronica Hale stormed inside, her perfume laced with alcohol, her eyes blazing with a venomous mix of arrogance and fear, and her voice rose in a shriek that sliced through the sterile air. "You can't keep her from me! She's mine!" And Lila flinched instantly, her small body shrinking back into the hospital bed, clutching her teddy bear as though the fabric alone could shield her, and Daniel surged forward, his chest rising with words that trembled on the edge of explosion. But before he could release them, another presence filled the room with a force more commanding than anger, and a clear, unwavering voice cut through the chaos. "Not anymore." And all eyes turned as Rachel Monroe entered, her posture sharp, her expression carved from steel, a folder of documents clutched firmly in her hand, her tone brooking no argument. "The state is placing Lila under protection immediately." And the authority in her words was like a gavel striking, final and indisputable, and Veronica's face twisted, fury and desperation battling across her features as she sputtered, cursed, and lunged forward as though possession could be reclaimed with volume alone, but her hands were empty, powerless in the face of law and evidence, and Daniel watched, his heart thundering as Lila's gaze darted between the women, her fear palpable, her tiny fingers trembling against her bear's worn ear. And then Rachel turned to Daniel, her eyes sharp but softened by the understanding of what this moment meant, and in her hand was a stack of paperwork, heavy with responsibility, heavy with promise, and she held it out not as a burden but as a chance, a lifeline, and Daniel felt the weight of destiny settle in his chest as his gaze fell upon the documents, for in their ink and signatures lay a question that would define the rest of his life, a choice between stepping forward into a storm of challenges or stepping back into the hollow comfort of safety, and his hand hovered, trembling not with doubt, but with the enormity of the decision, and he heard his sister Amelia's voice echo through memory, that plea he had carried for years, "Don't let them forget me." And now, with Lila's eyes watching, wide and pleading, Daniel knew the moment had come to decide whether he would finally keep a promise, not just to a lost sister, but to the frightened child whose fate hung on the movement of his pen. Daniel's hand lingered on the paper as though the weight of a lifetime had just been pressed into that single signature, his pen clattering faintly against the desk when he let it go, and as he sat back, breath trembling in his chest, he lifted his eyes to the child who had just become more than a responsibility. She was now tethered to him in a way no deal, no contract, no empire could rival. Lila stared up at him with wide, searching eyes, still clutching her teddy bear as though it were her last line of defense. And in that moment, Daniel realized the cruel world had stripped her of everything but fragments of innocence, and it was now his sacred duty to shield those fragments from being shattered forever, the enormity of it tightening his throat until words barely came. He wanted to tell her she was safe, but the word safe sounded too fragile in his own ears, too foreign after years of living in penthouses filled with silence, and yet he reached out a steady hand toward her, watching her hesitate, then inch forward, slipping her small palm into his as though testing whether it was real, whether promises meant something this time. Rachel's approving nod from across the room faded into the background, the bustling noise of the hospital dimming, for all Daniel could hear was the quiet thud of his heart as it synchronized with the fragile rhythm of the child's trust beginning to grow, and he thought of Amelia, of her laughter long buried by tragedy, of her whispered plea not to let the world forget her, and now, with Lila here, bruised but unbroken, he realized this was his chance to honor that promise, not by remembering, but by rebuilding. The corridors of his penthouse no longer loomed in his mind as hollow monuments of wealth, but as waiting walls that would soon echo with the sound of footsteps too light to belong to him, footsteps that could bring warmth where cold had reigned, and as he squeezed her tiny hand he vowed silently that those walls would never again bear witness to neglect, chains, or tears shed in dark closets. Still, a whisper of doubt crept in. Was he capable of this? Of being more than a man of figures and power? Of being a guardian? Perhaps even something like a father? And in that flicker of uncertainty, he looked at her again, at the way she leaned slightly into him, exhausted but brave, and he knew the answer was no longer about capability, but about choice, about love made real through actions. And as he rose, guiding her gently toward the door, he felt the sharp sting of Veronica's shadow looming, the certainty that she would not vanish quietly into the dark, that she would fight, claw, and manipulate to reclaim the control she once had. But this time Daniel was armed not with money or lawyers, but with resolve carved out of grief and a fierce determination to never again fail the innocent. Stepping into the crisp air outside the hospital, he knelt beside Lila, brushing a stray curl from her damp forehead, whispering that her nights of fear were over, that light was waiting in every dawn now. And though she didn't reply, the faint curl of her lips as she leaned her head against his shoulder was answer enough to ignite something long dormant within him. He lifted her into his arms, feeling her body relax as though she had been holding her breath for years, and in that embrace, he found not just the redemption he had unknowingly sought, but the beginning of a bond that would demand every ounce of courage and compassion he had left. As the car door closed and the city skyline loomed ahead, Daniel Mercer was no longer just a billionaire haunted by failure. He was a man who had chosen to fight for one fragile life, a man who understood that the ink of a single trembling signature could rewrite not only her story, but his own. Snowflakes fell like fragile whispers from the heavens as Daniel stepped out of the hospital with Lila nestled in his arms, her tiny frame melting against his chest, as if she had always belonged there, her breathing soft and uneven, her teddy bear clutched between her fingers, and as he walked through the frozen streets of Boston, for the first time in years, he didn't feel the city's loneliness pressing down on him, but instead a fragile warmth sparking in his chest, a warmth that came not from money or success, but from the trust of a child who had every reason to stop believing in people. When he opened the door to his penthouse, the same place that had always felt like a golden cage, it no longer seemed cold but alive with possibility, and he moved quickly, preparing a small pot of soup with his own hands. Clumsy, unused to such tasks, yet determined, tasting it to be sure it was good enough for her, then placing the bowl near the couch where he had wrapped her in a soft blanket that seemed to swallow her, adjusting the edges carefully so no draft could touch her fragile skin. When she stirred and whispered, her eyes flicking to the corners of the room, he understood before she spoke, but still he asked gently, "Why the light?" And her answer pierced his soul like a blade wrapped in sorrow. "Because I'm scared of the dark." A confession so pure, so heavy with the scars of nights locked in closets and punished silence, that Daniel's throat closed as tears blurred his vision, and, as he placed a small nightlight near her pillow, its glow painting the shadows with gold, he bent down and brushed her tangled hair from her forehead, whispering with a vow that sounded like prayer, "You'll never be alone in the dark again, not while I'm here." Words that trembled with both guilt for his past and promise for her future, and as she slowly drifted into sleep, her breathing evening out, her face softening in the rare peace of safety, Daniel sat there unmoving, watching, listening, guarding as if she were the most precious thing he had ever been entrusted with, and in the silence he felt Amelia's ghost, the sister he had failed, fade gently from accusation into forgiveness, as if through saving Lila he had finally redeemed himself, finally kept the promise he had once broken, and in that moment, the emptiness that had haunted his penthouse, his heart, his very existence, began to dissolve, replaced by the warmth of belonging, not because he had saved her, but because she had saved him too, teaching him that humanity wasn't in the deals he signed but in the love he gave. And as snow blanketed the city outside, Daniel Mercer, millionaire, CEO, man who had once believed himself untouchable, sat beside a child who had suffered more than anyone should, tears streaming down his cheeks, and whispered to the quiet night, "We're home now, both of us," sealing a bond that neither fear nor darkness could ever break again. A story of kindness, courage, and second chances, showing how one act of humanity can change a child's fate and redeem a broken soul.